Picture this. You're standing in the shadow of the Taj Mahal at dawn, your breath forming small clouds in the cool air. The white marble rises before you like a prayer made stone, its perfect dome catching the first golden light. But before you marvel at its beauty, before you whisper about eternal love, close your eyes and listen. Listen for the echo of a woman's scream that has bounced off these walls for 4 centuries. On June 17th, 1631, in a sultry chamber, hundreds of miles from here, Mumar's Mahal, the chosen one of the palace pressed her palms against blood-soaked linens and begged God for death after 30 hours of agony. She was delivering her 14th child. She would not live to see the 15th. Now open your eyes. The monument before you is not just a tomb of love. It is a gravestone for motherhood itself. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Welcome to the hidden world of royal motherhood, where queens were not crowned for their wisdom, but bred for their wombs, where pregnancy was not a blessing, but a political necessity, where every labor pain was monitored by courtiers, every miscarriage whispered about in palace corridors, and every stillborn child represented not just personal grief, but potential civil war. These are the stories they don't teach you in school. These are the women who paid the ultimate price for the continuation of bloodlines that we still study today, whose suffering was measured not in tears, but in heirs. Here are 10 of history's most fertile queens whose bodies became battlegrounds for dynasty, and whose lives were consumed by the demands of royal reproduction. 1. Queen Anne of England. Anne Stuart ascended the throne of England in 1702, but a crown was built on a foundation of 17 broken dreams. Despite 17 pregnancies, she died without surviving issue and was the last monarch of the House of Stuart. 17 times her body had swelled with hope for the Stuart dynasty. 17 times that hope had been crushed. Stillbirths, miscarriages, children who lived just long enough to be named before their tiny coffins were carried to Westminster Abbey's vault. The cruelty of Anne's story lies not just in the medical facts, but in the political reality that surrounded each loss. Every miscarriage was documented by court officials. Every stillbirth was examined by physicians seeking to assign blame. Her first child was a stillborn daughter in 1684, setting the tragic pattern that would define her life. When her longest surviving child, William, Duke of Gloucester, died at age 11 in 1700. It wasn't just a mother burying her son. It was a dynasty breathing its last breath. In the Westminster Abbey vault, where Anne now rests her sons, William, Duke of Gloucester, and infant George, and infant daughters, Anne Sophia, and 2 named Mary also lie in the vault, together with 6 stillborns. A further 6 children, gender unknown, were also stillborns or miscarriages. 20 small coffins surrounding one larger one, each representing not just a life lost, but dreams, deferred, hopes crushed, a kingdom's future hanging by threads that kept snapping. Anne's physicians theorized endlessly about her condition. Modern speculation suggests systemic lupus erythematosus antiphospholipid syndrome, or pelvic inflammatory disease. But what we know for certain is that each pregnancy became a public spectacle, each loss a national crisis. The Queen's womb was not her own. It belonged to England, and England kept demanding what it could not provide. Mumar's Mahal, in the opulent courts of the Mughal Empire, being beloved by an emperor, could be its own kind of curse. Mumar's Mahal died from postpartum hemorrhage in Burhanpur on the 17th of June, 1631, while giving birth to her 14th child after a prolonged labor around 30 hours. She had been pregnant almost every year of her 19-year marriage to Shah Jahan. While his other wives bore him one child, each Mumtaz was the most precious of Shah Jahan's wives. In practice, this meant that she yielded him 14 pregnancies, against one each for his other wives. Think about that for a moment. 19 years of marriage, 14 pregnancies, 7 surviving children. Her body never had time to recover, never had a season of rest. She traveled with Shah Jahan on his military campaigns, heavy with child riding in carriages across rough terrain, because an emperor's favorite could never be left behind. Despite her numerous pregnancies, Mumar traveled with Jahan's entourage throughout his earlier military campaigns and the subsequent rebellion against his father. Mumar died from preventable ailments, a postpartum hemorrhage that could have been contained with a blood transfusion. She died because medicine in 1631 could not save a woman bleeding out after 30 hours of labor. The Taj Mahal rises from the banks of the Yamuna River as testament not just to love, but to the cost of being treasured, not as a person, but as a producer of heirs. 3. Maria Theresa of Austria. If anyone elevated royal motherhood to an art form, it was Maria Theresa of Austria. The marriage was a love match, and 16 children were born to the couple, of whom 10 survived to adulthood. 16 children in 18 years, a pregnancy roughly every 13 months for nearly 2 decades, while simultaneously running one of Europe's largest empires. All the 16 pregnancies of Empress Maria Theresa ended in spontaneous vaginal deliveries at term, with no information on pregnancies ended in spontaneous abortion or preterm delivery. There were 15 live births, whereas one female baby was born without signs of life. But Maria Theresa wasn't just bearing children. She was running an empire. When Maria Theresa, Archduchess of Austria and Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, conceived and pregnancy reached 3 months, her pregnancy had to be proclaimed. While she was carried in a sedan chair during processions, she negotiated treaties between contractions, planned military campaigns while nursing infants, and managed the marriages of her elder children while giving birth to their younger siblings. Shortly after giving birth to the younger children, Maria So was confronted with the task of marrying off the elder ones. She led the marriage negotiations along with the campaigns of her wars and the duties of state. She used them as pawns in dynastic games and sacrificed their happiness for political advantage. Her most famous daughter, Maria Antonia, would become Maria Antoinette and die on the guillotine. Another daughter, Maria Elizabeth, was considered one of the most beautiful girls in Europe, until smallpox scarred her face, destroying her marriage prospects. Even 16 children couldn't guarantee a dynasty's survival. Quattro Talaka Catherine de' Medici. Perhaps no story illustrates the psychological toll of royal fertility pressure better than Catherine de' Medici. For 10 years after her marriage to the future Henry II of France, Catherine's womb remained empty, while the kingdom whispered about divorce. Francis had put them to bed to watch them jousting, and they jousted valiantly, and the Pope waited 34 days to see if his niece had conceived, but in vain. 10 years, a decade of monthly disappointments of physicians, prodding and examining of court whispers, growing louder with each passing season. The immense pressure for children from the young Princess Catherine led her to consult a doctor who advised her to literally try every trick in the book for getting pregnant, some of which were quite unpleasant, such as putting cow dung mixed with ground stag antlers on her source of life and drinking mule's urine. Picture a queen of France desperate enough to endure the humiliation of drinking animal urine, applying manure to her body, wearing amulets, consulting fortune tellers, all because her worth as a human being was measured solely by her reproductive capacity. Meanwhile, her husband openly flaunted his relationship with Diane de Warre, a woman nearly 20 years older than Catherine, but infinitely more powerful. When Catherine finally gave birth to her first child, Francis, in 1544, the relief was so overwhelming that courtiers wept. In spite of Henry's abiding attachment to his mistress, Diane de Porters, Catherine's marriage was not unsuccessful, and after 10 anxious years, she bore him 10 children, of whom 4 boys and 3 girls survived. But those first 10 barren years had scarred her psyche permanently. 5. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine lived one of history's most remarkable reproductive careers, bearing children for 2 different royal houses across 3 decades. Eleanor and Louis had 2 daughters, Marie and Alix, during her first marriage to Louis VII of France. But this marriage was annulled in 1152, partly because the only children they had were 2 daughters, Marie and Alix, and the royal couple needed male heirs. 2 months after her annulment, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. Eleanor had only 2 daughters by Louis VII, but to her new husband, she bore 5 sons and 3 daughters. The sons were William, who died at the age of 3, Henry Richard the Lionheart Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, and John, who would eventually inherit the crown of England. Henry and Eleanor had 8 children. 3 of their sons would rule as king, though Henry the young king only as co-ruler rather than sole monarch, as he prediscased his father. Eleanor's reproductive legacy extended far beyond her own children. She became the matriarch of the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for centuries, but Eleanor's fertility came at a cost. The separation of Eleanor and Henry during the next 5 years has been the subject of much speculation as to whether it was predominantly a matter of political expediency, an indication of a growing rift between the couple, or both. Certainly, Eleanor had fulfilled her queenly duties of providing both male heirs and daughters as commodities for alliances, but was now too old to provide further children. The revolt of her sons against her husband in 1173 put her cultural activities to a brutal end. Eleanor was captured while seeking refuge and spent nearly 16 years imprisoned by Henry II. Her children had become pawns and political games, and she had learned the hard lesson that even successful royal mothers could be discarded when their reproductive value ended. 6. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria may have famously declared she had the greatest horror of having children and would rather have none. But over the course of next 17 years, Victoria gave birth to 9 children. Victoria Albert, Bertie, Alice, Alfred Helena, Louise Arthur Leupold, and Beatrice. Remarkably, for the time, all of the children lived to adulthood. Victoria loathed pregnancy, describing the experience in letters to her daughter as one of being like a dog or a cow. She suffered not only with the physical effects of childbearing, but also with psychological ones, experiencing what the modern era would likely recognize as postpartum depression after several of her births. Each pregnancy took Victoria away from her role as monarch, a fact she detested. Between the birth of her first child in November of 1840 and the birth of her fourth in August of 1844, Queen Victoria had only 17 pregnancy-free months in which she was able to freely rule. The constant cycle of pregnancy-birth recovery and pregnancy again meant that Prince Albert essentially served as regent during these periods. Their 9 children married into royal and noble families across the continent, earning Victoria the socket grandmother of Europe. Victoria and Albert believed that dynastic marriages between their 9 children and European royalty would provide a peaceful future for Europe. But this strategy of using children as diplomatic tools meant that personal happiness was always secondary to political advantage. Victoria's descendants can be found in the royal families of Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, Sweden, Norway, and Spain. But this vast network of royal connections also carried genetic consequences. Victoria passed on the hemophilia gene to several of her children, leading to suffering and early death in multiple royal families across Europe. 7. Blanche of Castile. Blanche of Castile demonstrated that royal motherhood could be combined with political power, but only at enormous personal cost. Chronicles of the time report that Blanche and Louis had almost immediately become best of friends, and that the marriage was extremely happy. It produced 12 children, including the future St. Louis IX. Upon Louis' death in November 1226, from dysentery, he left Blanche, by then 38, regent and guardian of his children. Of her 12 or 13 children, 6 had died, and Louis's 6th afterwards, the sainted Louis IX, was but 12 years old. She had him crowned within a month of his father's death and forced reluctant baronses to swear allegiance to him. Blanche's situation was critical. The king's minority made the Capetian domains vulnerable to rebellious nobles who smelled opportunity. She had to fight wars, negotiate treaties, arrange marriages, and manage a kingdom, all while mourning half her children and protecting the survivors. Blanche took an active part in the affairs of the kingdom. She went with French forces to meet the armies of the Western barons allied with England, but instead of fighting them, she negotiated. The psychological toll was immense. Blanche of Castile suffered with a heart ailment, but continued to preside over court responsibilities. In 1252, she suffered a heart attack while on her way to the Abbey of the Lies for a retreat. She died still serving as regent while her son Louis IX was imprisoned during the Seventh Crusade. Her legacy wasn't just the children she bore, but the kingdom she preserved. Blanche's historical significance is important in both French and European contexts. She preserved the French crown and the Capetian dynasty at a critical time, but the cost was a life spent in service to others with no time for personal grief or recovery. 8. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz married King George III of England in 1761 and proceeded to fulfill her royal duty with relentless efficiency. Over the course of 21 years, she gave birth to 15 children, 13 of whom survived to adulthood. This made her one of the most prolific royal mothers in British history. Charlotte's pregnancies came in rapid succession, with barely time to recover between births. Her first child, the future George I, was born in 1762, just a year after her marriage. Her last child, Princess Amelia, was born in 1783, when Charlotte was 39 years old. For 2 decades, Charlotte was almost constantly pregnant or recovering from childbirth. The pressure on Charlotte was immense. She needed to produce not just an heir, but multiple sons to ensure the succession. The royal family had learned from the disasters of previous generations when dynasties had failed for lack of male heirs. Charlotte delivered, providing her husband with multiple sons who would ensure the Hanoverian line continued. But Charlotte's constant pregnancies took their toll. Contemporary accounts describe her as increasingly worn down by the physical demands of continuous childbearing. She grew heavier with each pregnancy and never fully recovered her health. The psychological strain was equally severe, watching her husband's mental health deteriorate while managing a large family and royal duties. Her children's lives were strictly controlled from birth. As one observer noted, the royal children lived like birds in a cage with every aspect of their lives managed for political advantage. Charlotte had given her life to producing heirs, but she had little real influence over how those children were raised or what their futures would hold. 9. Isabella of Valois. Sometimes the most tragic stories of royal fertility involve queens who died young, their reproductive potential cut short by the very duty they were born to fulfill. Isabella of Valois became Queen of England at age 6 when she married the future Richard II in 1396. When Richard was deposed and murdered, she was married to Charles V, of France's son, the future Charles II. Isabella's brief adult life was consumed by pregnancy and loss. She married Charles in 1406 at age 17 and immediately began the expected cycle of royal reproduction. Her first pregnancy ended in a stillbirth. Her second pregnancy produced a daughter who died in infancy. Her third pregnancy in 1409 would kill both mother and child. Isabella died in childbirth at Camp Compen on September 13, 1409, just shy of her 20th birthday. She had been married twice, born 3 children, and died serving the very system that had controlled her life since childhood. Her death left Charles without a queen, and France without the hoped-for male heir from this particular union. The tragedy of Isabella's story lies not just in her early death, but in how completely her value was tied to her reproductive function. She had been a pawn in diplomatic marriages since childhood, valued only for her ability to cement alliances and produce heirs. When her body finally failed under the strain, she was quickly forgotten, replaced by Charles's next wife in the endless quest for dynastic continuity. Her brief life illustrates the particular vulnerability of royal women in the medieval period. Married young, expected to produce children immediately and often dying in the attempt. Isabella's 3 pregnancies in 3 years represents the desperate pace at which royal reproduction operated with no consideration for the physical or emotional toll on the women involved. 10. Constance of Castile. Constance of Castile, Queen of France, as the second wife of Louis VII, demonstrated the relentless pace of royal reproduction in the 12th century. After Louis' annulment from Eleanor of Aquitaine, partly due to their lack of male heirs, he married Constance in 1154, desperately seeking the son that had eluded his first marriage. Constance immediately began producing children with remarkable frequency. Her daughter Margaret married first Henry, the young king, then later King Bela III of Hungary, while her daughter Alice was engaged to Richard I of England before marrying William, the Count of Ponthieu. But Constance's reproductive career was cut short by her death around 1160, likely from complications of childbirth or its aftermath. In approximately 6 years of marriage, Constance bore multiple children, but still failed to provide the male heir Louis desperately needed. Her death left Louis without a queen and without the son required to secure the Capetian succession. This failure led to Louis's third marriage to Adelphe Champagne, who finally produced the male heir Philip Augustus in 1165. Constance's story exemplifies the precarious position of medieval queens whose value was measured entirely by their reproductive success. Despite producing children rapidly and frequently, her failure to provide a male heir meant her reign was considered unsuccessful. Her early death, likely related to the physical toll of constant pregnancy, demonstrates the deadly cost of royal reproduction. The pressure on Constance was particularly intense because she was Louis's second wife, brought in specifically to remedy the failure of his first marriage. Every pregnancy carried the weight of dynastic expectation. Every birth was scrutinized for gender, and every loss represented not just personal grief, but political crisis. When you add up the numbers, the scale of sacrifice becomes staggering. These 10 queens endured at least 127 documented pregnancies between them. Queen Anne alone suffered through 17 pregnancies without a single surviving child. Maria Theresa spent nearly 2 decades pregnant or recovering from childbirth while simultaneously ruling an empire. Catherine de' Medici endured a decade of medical humiliation and public shame before finally conceiving. But these numbers tell only part of the story. Behind each pregnancy was a woman whose body was not her own, whose reproductive capacity was measured and monitored by physicians, courtiers, and foreign ambassadors. Their menstrual cycles were tracked, their morning sickness was public knowledge, and their labor pains were witnessed by crowds of political observers. The physical toll was immense. Before modern medicine, childbirth was Russian roulette. Infection was common, hemorrhaging was often fatal, and the maternal mortality rate hovered around 1 to 2% per birth. For queens who faced 10, 15, or even 17 pregnancies, the cumulative risk was terrifying. Many like Montes Mahal and Isabella of Valois paid the ultimate price. The psychological cost was equally devastating. These women watched their children die in infancy, suffered miscarriages that were treated as political failures, and endured the constant pressure to produce male heirs. They were reduced to their reproductive function, their worth measured in sons delivered and dynasties secured. Perhaps the most degrading aspect of royal pregnancy was its completely public nature. The birth of a royal baby was considered so important that it needed witnesses. Queens often labored before great audiences of people, a factor that only increased their fear and misery during childbirth. Marie Antoinette's delivery in 1778 was so poorly managed that the press of people, the heat, and the lack of fresh air in the rooms, whose windows had been sealed up for months against the winter cold, was too much for her after her 12-hour labor, and she fainted from lack of oxygen. These weren't medical personnel. These were political observers, there to ensure that no substitutions occurred. Courtiers in the inner room signaled the baby's sex to those in outer chambers by hurling their hats up the air. Arms were crossed if the baby was a girl. Picture that moment. You've just endured hours of agony to bring life into the world, and your first thought must be not of your child's health, but of the political ramifications of their gender. The Queen's labor pains were state business. Her cries echoed not just through palace corridors, but through the halls of international diplomacy. The sex of her child would determine military alliances. The survival of her infant would prevent or trigger wars of succession. What strikes most powerfully about these stories is not just the physical suffering, but the emotional isolation. These queens could not express frustration with their lot, could not rebel against the endless cycle of pregnancy and loss. To complain about bearing children was to complain about their primary, perhaps only value to the crown. Queen Anne's correspondence reveals glimpses of her private anguish. But these moments of vulnerability were rare and private. In public, she had to maintain the fiction that she was grateful for each pregnancy, hopeful for each birth, accepting of each loss as God's will. Catherine de' Medici developed a reputation for being cold and calculating. But perhaps that was the only way to survive. After watching half your children die, after enduring a decade of fertility treatments that bordered on torture, how do you continue to function as a mother and a monarch? You learn to treat your children as political assets rather than beloved individuals, because the alternative is madness. Maria Theresa's letters to her children are filled with love, but also with the exhaustion of someone who had spent her life serving forces larger than herself. She micromanaged their marriages, their careers, their daily routines. Because after 16 pregnancies and 40 years of rule control was the only comfort she had left. These stories feel impossibly distant. Relics of an age when women had no rights and medicine was primitive. But scratch the surface and you'll find the echoes reverberating through time. The pressure on modern royal women to produce heirs, the speculation about fertility, the countdown to pregnancy announcements, the public ownership of private reproductive choices. The difference is that today's royal pregnancies are cushioned by modern medicine and public relations teams. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, experienced severe morning sickness during her pregnancies, she received the best medical care available and sympathetic media coverage. When discussions arise about royal pregnancies, they're framed in terms of joy and celebration, rather than dynastic necessity. But imagine Anne Boleyn pacing her chambers at night, knowing that her failure to produce a son would likely mean exile or death. Imagine Catherine de' Medici measuring her worth not in intelligence or accomplishment, but in the monthly rhythm of her menstrual cycle. Imagine any of these women carrying not just a child, but the weight of kingdoms on their backs. The great irony of these stories is that for all the suffering, for all the children sacrificed on the altar of dynasty, most of these royal lines eventually died out anyway. The Stuart dynasty ended with Anne despite her 17 pregnancies. The Valois line ended with Catherine de' Medici's sons despite her 10 children. The direct Capian line continued through Blanche's son Louis IX, but transformed through marriage and conquest into something unrecognizable. All that pain, all that loss, all those women's lives consumed by the demands of bloodline and succession. And in the end, history moved on without them. The monuments they left behind. The Taj Mahal, the reforms of Maria Theresa, the Protestant settlement under Queen Anne. These survived not because of their children, but because of their own actions. Perhaps that's the most tragic lesson of all. These queens had value beyond their wombs, intelligence beyond their reproductive capacity, legacies beyond their children. But they lived in times that could not see past the immediate need for heirs to recognize the human beings bearing them. In Westminster Abbey, tourists walk past Queen Anne's tomb and read about her reign, her wars, her political achievements. But underneath their feet lie the tiny coffins of 17 dreams deferred. In Agra, millions visit the Taj Mahal and photograph its perfect symmetry. But few know that it was built on the grave of a woman who died because she loved an emperor too much to refuse his demands for children. In Vienna, portraits of Maria Theresa show her surrounded by her many surviving children, the picture of domestic happiness and imperial success. But those portraits don't capture the miscarriages, the infant deaths, the constant physical exhaustion of 2 decades of pregnancy. At Versailles, visitors see the opulent chambers where Maria Antoinette lived, but they don't hear the echoes of her mother's letters warning about the loneliness and tendency to cry that follows childbirth, or the political pressure that turned every pregnancy into a matter of state. These women deserved better. Better medicine, better choices, better recognition of their humanity beyond their reproductive capacity. They deserve to be remembered not just as mothers of dynasties, but as individuals who endured unimaginable pressure with remarkable strength. The next time you see a monument to royal love, pause for a moment. Listen for the echoes of women's voices that have been silenced by time and selective memory. Remember that behind every great dynasty was a queen whose body paid the price for its continuation. And perhaps ask yourself in our rush to celebrate the kings and empires they died to create, what other stories of sacrifice and suffering have we forgotten? The marble of the Taj Mahal still catches the dawn light just as it did on that June morning in 1631, when Mumtaz Mahal drew her last breath. If you know how to listen, you can still hear her scream echoing through its perfect chambers. Not a scream of love, but of a woman who gave everything she had to a world that demanded even more. The hidden cost of royal bloodlines was paid not in gold or territory, but in the bodies and souls of the women who bore the weight of dynasties on their backs. Their stories remind us that history's greatest monuments are often built on foundations of human sacrifice, and that the most invisible suffering is sometimes the most profound. These 10 queens represent just a fraction of the countless royal women who sacrificed their bodies, their health, and often their lives to the demands of dynastic reproduction. Their stories illuminate a hidden chapter of history where power and motherhood intersected in ways that few today can imagine. In remembering their suffering, we honor not just their sacrifice, but the humanity that their contemporaries too often forgot.